This week, I have the great pleasure to talk to my dear colleague, Dr. Nathan Eva, who is in the Department of Management and at Monash University in Australia. And I actually met Dr. Eva a couple of years ago, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I remember it was in South Carolina
Correct.
at the Association of Leadership Educators, and we sat next to each other during one of the big group sessions. And I think that's how we started our working relationship. And yeah, it's been 3 years now, maybe.
It has been. It has been absolutely wonderful. I remember that I can't remember the exact session it was. It was definitely a round table. I remember in the big auditorium or in the top right hand corner. So it's very clear in my mind, Narsha. Thank you. Yeah, looking forward to having a chat.
Absolutely. And you and I just recently worked together through the Leadership Educators Academy as facilitators for the program. And so we continue to share this passion of leadership education, leadership development. And now we get to talk about the vastness of global leadership and trying to understand what that is. So I have a couple of questions for you, and I'm looking forward to what you will share. And I'm hopeful that the learners who are watching will also get some nuggets that they'll be able to use as they think about conceptualization and practice of leadership in global as well as multicultural spaces. So with that, here's a question I'm going to start with. And this is a question that I like to ask anyone when we get to work together. So I'm curious, if you were not a leadership educator and scholar, what would you be doing right now?
I asked my wife this question, and she's going, you'd be back being a consultant. There'd be a very good chance that I'd be back working at Accenture being a consultant. I said that maybe I would be like an otter trainer at an aquarium or something like that. Yeah, she poured water on that idea pretty quickly, just saying, yeah, no, you'd be a consultant. Like, all right. So no, I really enjoyed my time at Accenture, so I probably would be still there, being a
Okay.
consultant.
All right, good. So can you describe your current role as well as your teaching interests and research interests and the impact that you hope to make with the work you do?
No worries. I'm a senior lecturer at Monash University in Melbourne, Australia. If you look at a map in Australia, right down the bottom. Senior lecturer basically means somewhere between an assistant and an associate professor in the US system. It's just how we break it up in Australia and the UK. My research focuses on how we create non-egotistical leaders, so non-command and control, non-egocentric leaders. There are two parts about this. The first one is demonstrating that it works. And so for me, the majority of my research has been around servant leadership, a little bit on ethical and collaborative leadership. And what we've tried to demonstrate here is that not only does it work in making people feel good, increasing their well-being, increasing their work-life balance and the like, but it also has long-term impacts on performance of the organisation because employees are willing to go above and beyond for the organisation, work hard, look after the customers and the like. In the US, you can look at examples like Southwest Airlines, Starbucks, TD Industries, examples like that who are led by a servant leadership philosophy. And one of the things that I've really loved about doing this research is that I've been able to research servant leadership in China, in the US, in Australia, in Indonesia, in Nigeria, in Saudi Arabia, in the UK, I think of Malaysia. So we've been able to look at the differences across multiple different countries and see that that approach to leadership, where you're putting your followers first, you're putting your people before profits, does have an impact on profits, funnily enough. The second part of my research, and this leads into my education as well, is how we're developing leaders who aren't all about themselves, who want to go and do something good for the community, good for the world, and good for the followers that they have. Specifically, a lot of my research and the way in which I teach is around non-prototypical leaders. So essentially people who don't look like me. So non-male, not non-white. And I've been really excited about the work we've been able to do there. Especially, I'm really proud of the work we've got at the moment around adolescent girls' leader development and how we're developing young women into leaders and not into white male leaders. So that's exciting there. In terms of the impact, I go back to this idea of trying to change the way Australia leads. So going out into organisations, going out into secondary colleges, going out into universities and having these conversations, running training sessions and demonstrating that there are alternate ways to the command and control leadership that actually has huge impacts on organisations.
Mm-hmm. Fantastic. So from your perspective, then, how do we define global leadership? What does it mean to have this concept of global leadership?
It's a really, really good question. And you posed this question to me about a week ago, and I've been pondering and thinking about this, and I don't have a perfect answer. I think that there are some traits that are universal, that there are some things about humans that are universal that we can continue, that we can draw on. Connections, wanting to build connections with other people, wanting to be able to trust our leaders, wanting to be able to trust our employees, wanting to be heard, wanting to have a fair go. There are a lot of subtle differences leading in different organisations, leading in different countries that people do need to take into account. But in terms of what is global leadership, from a very boring sort of definition, I would say it's thinking about leadership not just at a organisational or at a local level. It is taking into account the broader context of the country that you're in, the organisation that you're in, and the place that you live in. And so if we take an example like China, for example, it's understanding what it means to be working there under the Chinese government, working alongside the Chinese government and what you're doing, working alongside Chinese officials. It's a very different way of thinking as if you were working in Brazil alongside the rich cultural history of Brazil and the political system in Brazil. You need to be able to start to understand how those things play out in your organisation, how culture plays out in the importance of who you have around you. And to give you one last example here, I teach a leadership class over in Italy each year. And I love getting to chat to the business owners. And there's a particular panini store that I go to, and I need to get there at a certain time. I have to finish class at a certain time so I can get there before it closes. Because the manager there, he knows exactly how much he needs to earn to be able to pay his staff a good wage and to be able to look after his family. And he's divided that by 350 odd days a year. And once he makes that exact amount of money for the day, he's done. He's done. Why would he go spend the rest of his time making sandwiches when he could go spend it with his family? And so understanding the differences and nuances that overlay culture and people are incredibly important within global leadership.
Mm. And you just led into the next question that I have, which is, in your perspective, or from your perspective rather, what are the 3 top qualities or characteristics a leader must have in order to lead effectively in global spaces?
It's a really good question. I would start with an actual want to know and understand people. If you're going to be leading in global spaces, and whether this is leading, say, in the US, working with global teams in the Philippines, in Delhi and the like, wanting to actually understand who your team is and what makes them tick, because people are going to be very different than what it's going to be like than, say, people you're working with in Texas or in New York. And then especially if you're going to go do secondments or go and work in a different country, you really need to want to know the people that you're working with to be able to understand what motivates them. When you're talking about, why we do this work, what is it that makes them get out of bed in the morning to go work for your organisation or go work for you? That is going to change across different cultures. Culture has an impact on that. I think as a really sort of cop-out easy skill, communication is a big one, and knowing how to communicate for different cultures, for different organisations. I think that there are some nice tools out there. So you can look at the Globe study, you can look at Globe Smart, you can look at Hofstede's to be able to give you some indications of bits and pieces, some cultural specific management tips there, specifically around communication. There are inherent flaws with a lot of these models. They are narrow because people are complex, cultures are complex, and you can't neatly put them into 5 or 6 factors. But I've always found that they've been a nice starting point to start a conversation, at least to know what's going on there. The other thing that, so I've got to give you a third now. The other one is just coming down to, for me, trust. You need to be able to trust your employees. When we're at home, we know people. We know when you know the people around us, they've built up our trust over time. And when we see people who look like us, who sound like us, who have the same values, we automatically trust them, right? Because I'm a trustworthy guy. People like me, they must be trustworthy. When you step out into a global role, there's going to be people from a range of different backgrounds, and at times that people are going to do things a little bit differently than the way in which we've grown up. And that trust, your natural inclination to trust might be pushed against. I remember, I'm going to get his name wrong. I'm pretty sure it's Jack Lowe, TD Industries. He talks about there's 2 ways that you can approach trust. You can either trust your employees until they demonstrate they're not trustworthy, and that's going to be the best way to manage and lead them and have an impact. The other way is treat everyone as dishonest until they prove your trustworthiness, and then it's just going to take years to get off the ground. With any global role, there's a reason why these people have been hired by your company. There's a reason why that they've been assigned to you. We need to be able to trust the teams that we have to begin with, to be able to allow them to engage in the work that they're clearly qualified and able to do. So sort of circling back, trust, communication, and a real want to know and build connections with people.
Mm-hmm. Those are really good points. You just mentioned that you teach a class in Italy every year. So my next question is around your experiences around the globe. What have your travels around the world taught you about leadership? Are there any personal or professional experiences that stand out for you?
Very sad. I've been incredibly lucky to spend a lot of time in most continents. I haven't been to South America yet. I need to do that. But thinking on it and reflecting on it, to a certain extent, I feel that everyone that I've met and everyone I've interacted with and everyone I've worked with, there's the basic human needs are pretty much the same. There's a need to want to belong, there's a need to want to connect with people, and there's a need to want to have meaning in the work that you're doing. Now, that doesn't mean, meaning in terms of planting the most trees or solving climate change or changing the world like that. The meaning might be purely being able to go to a job so I can put food on the table for my family, so that I can send my kids to school, that I can support my parents, things like that. And tapping into that meaning is important, and you only get to tap into that by building these connections. And when I think about the people that I've met, sometimes and as Australians, we tend to build connections very quickly. And in other places in the world, that takes a significant amount of time. I know that with my Dutch colleagues, it's something that it takes that little bit of time. With the German colleagues, I feel that they're trusting of me straight away, which possibly could be worrying. But building those relationships. We go to China, this idea of Guangxi. If we go to India, just building trust between partners for you to be able to go and do this work. It's something that as leaders that we need to understand that all people are different, that we're going to have to approach every individual differently. Not everyone's going to want to share their life story in the first time that they meet you, and others will. That it might take, I think if I've got a colleague in Italy, and to be honest, I think it took us about 3 years before we finally felt like, it was like, we've finally got this strong relationship now. So those things are going to take time. But if I go back to what I've learned, people are people that people want to build connections, want to have meaning and what they're doing. And as leaders, it's just trying to help facilitate that.
Mm-hmm. So you are from Australia, and you have traveled around the world, and I'm curious about the social and cultural perspectives around leadership in Australia. Specifically, what narratives are told about leadership? Are there any symbols that are used? What qualities and characteristics are valued within the nation? And basically, if I were visiting Australia, what would I need to know about leadership?
It's a really complex question. I want to give you just a little bit of an outline,
Sure.
very quickly. That Australia has roughly about 25 million people, so just a tick more than Florida, but Australia is pretty much the size of the US minus Alaska. So it's a very we're very spread out. We've still got quite a small population, and of that small population, about 25%, 26% are born overseas compared to the US, which is about 14%, and about 50% of Australians have a grandparent who was born overseas. So it is a very multicultural country, and so while we still are predominantly white, predominantly Eurocentric, that we're very proud of the melting pot culture that we have. It means that if you're going out into an organisation, and I'm going to say this at more sort of a middle level than senior level, because we still have a problem with more men being named Andrew holding CEO positions than women who hold CEO positions, and definitely more than non-white people holding CEO positions. So we still have quite a way to go. But in terms, if I'm talking middle management, you're very likely to have a leader who is maybe born in a different country than you, maybe speaks a different language at home than you, has definitely had different grandparents than you, and those different cultural experiences. And they do all play out within the Australian culture. I think generally what I would say is, if you're coming to Australia, you've got to be ready for the informality. I've always been surprised whenever I go to the US and people refer to me as Dr. Eva. I would never be referred to that in Australia, and I don't know. There's something about the respect that I get in America I just don't get here. We are very informal. That the power distance in Australia is incredibly low, which is good in terms of a management sense and a leadership sense as well. So it means that if you're within a team, it is expected that you're giving your opinion, that you're having a go, that if you've been brought on a team to have a dissenting opinion, that you don't just go along with the company line, you don't go along with the leader's line. You're there to say, actually, no, my expertise say that we shouldn't be doing X, Y, and Z. And so I think that that's quite an important thing to understand as a leader within Australia, that you're likely to have people who are going to call you out and say that I disagree, or you're wrong, or why did you make that decision? And I think that can be confronting for some leaders. And I know, as an Australian, having worked and done some work overseas, I know that that attitude is not always welcome in different countries. And a couple of times where I've gone to bosses who are saying to me, I disagree. And just the daggers that I get. And it's like, no, you don't disagree with me in front of people.
Saving face, right.
So the other thing is that we do have quite a strong and rich and vibrant Asian community, and very, very diverse Asian community, which have been incredibly important for the development of Australia's culture, development of Australian business, and allowing us to lead in multiple different ways. So picking up different parts of how different parts of the world work. I think that in terms of how we've built how we build our relationships, Australia's Australia in terms of, you know, if we're trying to negotiate or building businesses, that relationship stuff generally hasn't mattered as much. Doing a lot more work with China, for example, means that we are spending more time building meaningful relationships with our business partners, which it can only be a good thing. And the other point that I know I've talked about this for a little bit now, but the other point I want to make is around different religious holidays. I was having a chat to my wife before I jumped on. She used to work for one of Australia's big banks, and she was talking about the fact that they've got leave specific for, it's a 5-day block of religious leave that you can use at any stage for whatever religious holidays that you celebrate. So organisations in Australia, especially large organisations. So while we still are predominantly Christian, I think it's about 60%. You can check the statistics on that if you're interested. But we do have a lot of people who are celebrating Ramadan, who are celebrating Diwali. So a lot of organisations are giving people those days off if they are celebrating those particular holidays, or it's being integrated into our organisation. So Monash, we celebrate Diwali, we celebrate Start and End Ramadan, that those holidays are integrated within our organisation, and it's the same with the big banks, the consulting firms, the large public sector firms as well, that we try, because again, we're a melting pot, you're leading lots and lots and lots of different cultures. We try and make sure that we're respecting that as much as we can. We are so far from perfect at this, and we are still struggling. And anyone who looks deeply into Australia's history, you'll see that it has been a struggle about how we've managed a diverse population. But for the most part, people are trying to get better at this. People are trying to learn how to lead a diverse workforce in a much more inclusive way than what it was 5 years ago, what it was 10 years ago, and definitely better than what it was 30 years ago.
I have a lot of family and friends that have moved to Australia. For Zimbabwe, Australia is one of the top destinations for immigration, and so it's good to hear a perspective around sort of the contextual piece about how Australia functions and how the social and cultural identities impact the national identity as well. I'm really intrigued by this idea of the religious holidays being taken into consideration. In the US, we don't have that. But before I talked to you, I talked to a CEO of Stanbic Bank in Kenya, and he was talking about the same thing, about how at the bank they've really made an effort to have religious leave available for the employees, because it does impact how the employers show up to work and the kind of work that they do. So I'm glad to hear that this is something that other parts of the world are really considering and acting upon as part of the organizations that are part of the economy. So it's good to learn about that. Thank you for that bit. Well, we're at our, yes, go ahead.
I was going to say, just on that, Nasha, that, and I think this is really important for people who are studying global leadership, to take a real interest in what these, in the different cultural and religious celebrations across the globe. Because for us to truly lead global organisations, we need to not just do it from a Judeo-Christian standpoint, that it needs to be where all religious holidays or all cultural holidays are allowed to coexist together.
Right.
And yeah, as students of global leadership, it needs to be something that we're talking about.
Absolutely. Just listening to what you shared during our talk, I'm thinking of Hall's model about culture as an iceberg. And it seems like the work that we need to do is really at the bottom of the iceberg, right? So that relationship building comes in, and learning those nuances that really do impact the types of relationships that we have within the leadership arena. So that is where the work is to be done. I think we can easily identify songs and food and holidays on the calendar, but it's really are we willing to do the work? Are we willing to sharpen our human skills so that we can really understand how these complexities impact our interaction? So thank you for prompting that reflection for me. But you were just talking about advice that you give for students. So let's get into that. What advice do you have for doctoral students who are studying global leadership?
Be driven by, I guess it's very similar to what I would say to most research students. Be driven by the research questions that that you are wanting to be interested in, that we don't know. There are so many elements around the world that that need to be explored. What I would say is, and I see this quite a lot, is, oh, I'm going to go test a model in a different country, and I'm going to see whether it holds up in a different country. For a lot of, I guess, positivist research, whether that's quantitative or qualitative positivist research, chances are it's going to hold up. Chances are that good leadership is going to lead to good outcomes, no matter where it is in the world. The best global leadership research that I've seen out there are the ones who take the nuances of the countries into account and say, well, what are the things that should change? Leadership and performance, to a certain extent, moderated by culture, probably isn't going to change that much unless you're really embedding or looking at something that is specific to that country, that culture, that might change, adapt, move that relationship. I think it's going a little bit deeper and engaging with not just the leadership literature, but what's going on in the international management, the international business, the international sociology literature. I'd suggest anyone who's not looking at the Journal of International Business Studies, for example, to have a look at the Journal of International Business Studies and what they're doing and how they're talking and analysing culture. Global Strategy Journal is another one as well that starts to talk about how culture does affect different parts of profit, non-profit organisations as well. Be open, be broad, be interdisciplinary, but don't just lift and shift a US-centric model into Pakistan, into India, into China. I probably reject a manuscript about every month that is testing a model that I've seen tested somewhere else in a new country context, finding the exact same results and saying, well, it's different, it's Pakistan. Well, that's good, but how is it actually extending our knowledge? How are you actually talking about the richness of Pakistan and the richness of that particular environment? I know that when I do work on the Chinese public sector, one of the things that we really try and tap into is the reward structure of the Chinese communist setup, and how changes in the Chinese civil service law have affected the way in which leaders lead and the impacts of it. And we go specifically to that. Our research questions are informed by the cultural, by the political changes, by the cultural nature. And for global students, I would say that is where I'd want you to be, is lead from culture first, rather than lift and shift across to see if it exists.
That's really good advice. Good advice for not only students, but also educators to think of as we engage in teaching and learning about global leadership. Those are all the questions that I had. Do you have any last words that you would like to share? What questions are you thinking about? What ideas are you thinking about that would help us in our learning?
Toby Newstead brought this up to, she's a leadership researcher and educator out of Tasmania, Australia. She brought this up with me the other day about leadership in place. And I've started to read quite a bit about leadership in context and leadership in place, and how place shapes the way in which we lead. That our communities, our culture, our upbringing really shapes the way in which we lead. Too often we think about leadership education and leadership research in terms of the leader first, and almost this heroic focus on the leader who can change the way the world works. But reframing that and thinking around, well, how is place affecting leadership? How is place pushing you in particular directions? I think is really quite interesting, and something that I still don't think is explored enough. And for those who are doing their doctorate in global leadership, I would urge them to be thinking about how place, how culture, how context affects leadership, how rather than how a leader leads in a particular different culture. Because I feel that that's a big thing that we're still struggling to grapple with.
That's a really good point. And I think I would add, so place is important, but also time, and how time impacts concepts, but also culture, and especially looking at the global and social moment that we're in right now, that is going to definitely impact conceptualization and practice of leadership. I feel like there's
100%.
a model there that's waiting for you to just put it into our into our midst, so we can look at place, time, and leadership. I think that's a book that's waiting for you.
Oh, thanks, Nasha. I'll put it on the fire. It's been a pleasure talking to you today, Nasha. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And I'm looking forward to our continued conversations and collaborations.
Me too. All the best.